2 hours after I drove away from that barbecue, my husband and his daughter pulled into the driveway of his mother's house and found a lawyer's car waiting at the curb, a yellow envelope taped to the front door, and their entire understanding of who really owned that house about to collapse in front of the whole family. But to understand how we got there, you need to go back to that afternoon. Back to the moment a spilled glass of lemonade turned into the last mistake my husband ever let his daughter make in front of me. My name is Ashley Collins. I'm 45. I spent 18 years teaching 3rd grade before I stepped back to help run my husband's small contracting business. And until that Saturday in June, I would have told you I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one, a good one. The kind you build slowly with patience. The kind where you learn to live around old wounds that aren't yours to heal. Ryan and I had been married 9 years. He came with a daughter from his first marriage, Madison, 22, now in her last year of college, and I came in knowing exactly what that meant. I never tried to be her mother. I never used that word, never asked for that title. I told myself early on that respect doesn't require love, and love isn't something you can force a grown child to feel for you. I just wanted peace. I wanted us to function like a family, even a complicated one. That Saturday, his mother, Helen, was hosting the annual summer barbecue at her house, the same gathering she'd thrown every June for as long as I'd known the family. I got there at 9 in the morning. I unloaded 4 bags of groceries myself, strung the lights along the porch rail, set up the folding tables, and stood over the grill in the heat for 2 hours because Ryan said his back was bothering him. That was fine. I didn't mind. I liked making Helen's yard look good. She'd always been kind to me in her quiet way, even when the rest of the family treated me like a placeholder. Madison arrived late, the way she always did. Sunglasses pushed up into her hairphone in her hand. Barely a glance in my direction as she walked past the grill toward her cousins. I was carrying a tray of corn to the table when I turned, just turned the ordinary way anyone turns in a crowded yard, and my shoulder grazed hers. Her lemonade tipped a few drops, landing on her white sneaker. That was it. That was the whole event. She spun around like I'd shoved her. "Don't ever touch me again." Her voice cracked across the yard loud enough that conversation stopped. Aunts turned. Cousins turned. Someone's fork paused halfway to their mouth. I actually laughed at first, thinking she had to be joking, because it was lemonade, because it was an accident, because I had just spent 2 hours cooking her favorite ribs. "Madison, it was an accident. You did that on purpose." She snapped. "You always do this. You always find a way to touch me or get near me like you're trying to prove something." I felt my face go hot, not from embarrassment, from disbelief. I looked around for Ryan, expecting him to step in to say something, anything to remind his daughter that I'd been standing over a hot grill on her behalf since 9 in the morning. Audie. Instead, I watched him walk toward us with that particular look he got whenever Madison raised her voice. The look of a man bracing to manage her feelings before anyone else's. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at the lemonade on her shoe, or the tray still balanced in my hands. He looked at me, and his voice came out flat final, like he was reading from a script he'd already written in his head years ago. "Apologize to my daughter or leave. I want you to understand something about me. I am not a dramatic person. I don't raise my voice. I don't storm out of rooms. I spent 2 decades managing a classroom of 8-year-olds by staying calm when everyone around me wasn't. But something in me went very quiet and very still in that moment. The way water goes still right before it turns to ice. I looked at my husband. I waited for him to soften, to say, "Come on, both of you, let's just cool down." I waited for anyone in that yard, his sister, his brother-in-law, even one of the cousins who'd eaten off my grill 20 minutes earlier to say a single word in my defense. No one did. "No," I said. Just that. I set the tray of corn down on the table, wiped my hands on my apron, untied it, and folded it over the back of a chair. Helen was standing near the porch steps, and for 1 second our eyes met. She didn't say anything either, but there was something in her face I didn't have time to read yet, something that wasn't surprise. I picked up my purse from the porch swing, walked to my car without looking back, and drove home in a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I didn't cry. I remember that clearly because I expected to, and I didn't. I just drove, replaying 9 years in my head, wondering how many other moments like this one I had quietly swallowed without naming them for what they were. I had no idea pulling into our driveway alone that somewhere across town, a phone was already ringing a law office, trying to reach me about a house. A decision made 3 years earlier, and a piece of paper that was about to change everything. The house was quiet when I got home. The kind of quiet that used to feel peaceful, and now just felt hollow. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment before I even set my purse down, staring at the counter where I'd left a note that morning, reminding Ryan to bring extra ice. 9 years, I thought. 9 years of notes like that. Small, thoughtless acts of care nobody ever seemed to notice until they were missing. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat at the table, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself actually think back over those years instead of brushing past them the way I usually did. When I married Ryan, Madison was 13, caught in that raw, unsteady age between childhood and something else, still grieving the divorce. Even though it was 2 years behind her by then, I never once tried to replace her mother. I made that promise to myself before I ever moved a single box into that house. I would be steady, I would be present, and I would never demand a title I hadn't earned. I thought foolishly maybe that if I gave her enough time and enough space, she'd eventually let me exist in her life as something other than an intruder. I paid for her first semester of college out of my own savings when Ryan's business hit a rough patch, and he was too proud to ask his mother for help. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours after her car accident sophomore year, because Ryan was stuck out of state on a job and couldn't get a flight back until the next morning. I drove her to 3 follow-up appointments that spring, sat through 2 physical therapy sessions just so she wouldn't be alone in the waiting room, and threw her a 21st birthday party the following year that I planned down to the last string light because she'd mentioned once offhand that she'd always wanted one like that. She never said thank you, not once, not for any of it. I used to tell myself that was fine, that gratitude wasn't the point, that I wasn't doing it to be thanked. But there's a difference between not needing thanks and being treated like you don't exist. And somewhere over the years, that line had gotten blurry in my own head. Whenever I mentioned any of this to Ryan carefully, gently, never as a complaint, he had the same answer every time. Give her time, Ash. She's been through a lot. And I did give her time. I gave her 9 years of it. But the years didn't soften her toward me. If anything, they hardened something in her, like she'd decided early on that treating me as temporary was safer than risking anything else. I remembered the Christmas 2 years ago, when she called me Dad's mistake to her cousin in the kitchen, not realizing I was standing right behind the pantry door. I remembered how Ryan, when I told him that night, said only that she probably didn't mean it that way, that she was going through a hard semester. There was always a reason. There was always a hard semester, a stressful breakup, a bad week. I stopped counting the excuses somewhere around year 6. Today wasn't really about a splash of lemonade. I understood that clearly now, sitting alone in my kitchen with my tea going cold. Today was the moment 9 years of small erasers finally added up to something I couldn't swallow anymore. My husband had looked me in the eye, in front of his entire family, and chosen his daughter's tantrum over the woman who'd spent the morning cooking for all of them. And the worst part wasn't even the choosing. It was how easy it had looked on his face. Like it wasn't a choice at all. I was still sitting there when I finally checked my phone, which I'd left in my purse since the moment I'd stormed off. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, all within the last 40 minutes. I didn't recognize it at first. But the voicemail left no room for confusion. Mrs. Collins, this is David Harper from Harper Legal Group. It's important that we speak as soon as possible. Please call my office back today if you're able. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, genuinely confused. I didn't know any lawyers named Harper. I hadn't been in any accidents, hadn't been sued, hadn't signed anything I could recall that would warrant this kind of urgency in a stranger's voice. My first thought, absurdly, was that something had happened to Helen, that she'd fallen or worse, and someone was trying to reach me, because Ryan's phone had been in his pocket during the argument, and mine hadn't. My hands weren't quite steady as I dialed the number back. It rang twice before a receptionist picked up, and when I gave my name, her voice shifted immediately. Gentler, more careful the way people sound when they know something you don't. Mrs. Collins, thank you for calling back. Mr. Harper would like to see you in person if you're able to come in today. It concerns a matter involving Helen Brooks. My chest tightened. Is she all right? She's fine, the receptionist said quickly. This isn't about her health. It's about a legal matter she asked us to handle. Mr. Harper felt it was best explained face to face. I looked at the clock. It was barely 4:50 in the afternoon. I thought about Ryan and Madison, probably still at the barbecue. Probably telling everyone their version of what happened. Probably not missing me at all yet. I grabbed my keys off the counter, my tea still untouched and going cold behind me, and drove across town, not knowing that within the hour I would be sitting across a desk, being told something about my own life that I never could have imagined. Harper Legal Group occupied the second floor of a quiet brick building downtown, the kind of place with heavy wooden doors, and a receptionist who offered me water before I'd even sat down. I remember noticing how cold my hands were despite the warm afternoon. How my mind kept circling back to the barbecue, to Ryan's face, to the silence of that yard, even as I tried to focus on why I was here instead. David Harper turned out to be an older man, maybe late 50s, with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who'd delivered difficult news to a lot of people over the years, and had learned not to rush it. He shook my hand, offered me a seat across from his desk, and folded his hands together before he spoke. Mrs. Collins, thank you for coming in on short notice. I know this is unusual, and I'll try to make this as clear as I can. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents I didn't recognize, a property deed, a trust agreement, several pages of dense legal language with tabs marking specific sections. My eyes skimmed the top of the deed and caught on a name I wasn't expecting to see. Mine. 3 years ago, Harper said, Helen Brooks transferred ownership of her house, the house where the family gathering was held today, into a trust with you, named as the sole beneficiary. The property was legally retitled in your name at that time. Ryan and Madison have continued residing there under an informal arrangement Helen set up, but the ownership itself has belonged to you since that transfer was finalized. I sat very still. I actually asked him to repeat it because it didn't fit anywhere in what I understood about my own life. That house, I said slowly. Helen's house. The one we were just at this morning. That house, he confirmed. Why would she do that? And why wouldn't she tell me? Harper explained that Helen had come to him 3 years earlier, not long after a health scare that had frightened her, more than she'd let on to the rest of the family, though she'd wanted the house protected, secured for someone she trusted completely. And she'd told him. Harper read this part almost verbatim, like he wanted to get her words exactly right, that I was the only one who had shown up for her without being asked, without expecting anything back, she said. He continued, glancing at his notes, that you were the only one who ever treated her like a person and not an obligation. I thought of every Sunday I'd spent driving Helen to her cardiology appointments, while Ryan claimed he was too busy with work. I thought of the winter I'd found a contractor and paid out of pocket to fix her leaking roof before Ryan even knew the gutters had failed. None of that had felt like it was building toward anything. I'd done it because I loved her plainly, and simply the way you love people who never make you feel like a burden. Harper turned to another page. There's a condition attached to the arrangement. Helen structured it so that Ryan and Madison could continue living in the house comfortably, so long as certain terms were respected. Specifically, he tapped the clause. If either of them, at any point, was found to have insulted, threatened, or humiliated you, you would have the legal right to terminate their residency immediately. The room went very quiet. I thought about Madison's voice cracking across that yard. Don't ever touch me again. I thought about Ryan's face, cold and unmoved. Apologize to my daughter or leave. I hadn't known standing in that yard an hour ago that I was standing on ground I already legally owned. Do you want to enforce it? Harper asked, not unkindly. It wasn't a question meant to push me one direction or the other. It was simply the question the moment required. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my forearm, where a faint red mark was still visible from where Madison had shoved past me earlier trying to get to her car. Something I hadn't even registered as a bruise until just now sitting in this office under fluorescent light. I thought about 9 years of being tolerated instead of welcomed. I thought about every excuse I'd accepted, every give her time I'd swallowed without comment, every moment I'd made myself smaller so the peace in that family could stay intact. I wasn't angry in the way people picture anger. No shaking, no raised voice. What I felt was closer to clarity. A door quietly closing somewhere inside me, one I hadn't even realized had been propped open for years. Yes, I said, I want to enforce it. Harper nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer, but wanted to hear me arrive at it myself. He explained the next steps, the paperwork already prepared in advance at Helen's request, the locksmith on standby, the formal notice that would need to be delivered in person. He asked if I wanted to be there when it happened. I thought about it for a moment and then shook my head. No, I don't need to see their faces. I just need it done properly and legally and quietly. As I stood to leave, Harper mentioned one more detail almost in passing, that Helen had specifically asked to be present at the house when the notice was delivered, that she'd said this was something she needed to say to her son herself, after years of staying silent. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet. I only knew, walking out of that office into the fading afternoon light, that I was no longer the same woman who had driven away from that barbecue 2 hours earlier. While I was sitting in that office learning the truth about a house I never knew I owned, Ryan and Madison were still finishing out the barbecue back at Helen's, is apparently in good spirits, apparently untroubled by what had happened. I only pieced this part together later from things Helen told me afterward. But it's worth telling because it shows exactly where their heads were in the hours before everything changed. According to Helen, Ryan spent the rest of the afternoon acting like nothing had happened at all. He grilled the remaining burgers, laughed with his brother-in-law about some football game, and when someone asked where I'd gone, he waved it off with something like, "She needed to cool down. She'll be fine." Madison, for her part, sat by the pool with her cousin, scrolling her phone, occasionally mentioning the scene I'd supposedly caused, framing it like I was the one who'd overreacted to an innocent accident. On the drive home that evening, Helen said Madison actually laughed about it. She'll come crawling back tomorrow with an apology. She reportedly told her father, acting like nothing happened, same as always. Ryan agreed. He told her half-joking that this was just how I processed things, that I'd sulk for a day, and then smooth it all over the way I apparently always did. It wasn't cruelty exactly in his mind. It was just how he'd learned to categorize me over the years. The reasonable one, the one who always came around, the one who never made things difficult for long. They pulled into the driveway a little after 7, expecting an ordinary evening. Instead, they found a car they didn't recognize parked at the curb, a man in a suit standing near the front steps with a folder in hand, and a locksmith's van idling farther down the street, for Ryan Helen told me, actually thought for a second he'd pulled up to the wrong house. David Harper introduced himself calmly, the same unhurried manner he'd used with me an hour earlier. He explained that he represented Helen Brooks, and that he had documents to deliver regarding the property. Ryan, confused, asked if something had happened to his mother's estate, planning some routine update he hadn't been told about. Harper simply handed him the envelope. Ryan tore it open right there on the porch. Helen said she watched his face as he read the first line, watched the color drain out of it in real time. The deed was direct, unambiguous, official, Ashley Collins, legal owner, effective 3 years prior. "That's ridiculous," Madison said, grabbing the paper out of her father's hands, scanning it herself like she expected to find some kind of mistake, some clerical error that would make this whole thing dissolve. "This has to be fake. Grandma would never do this without telling us." Harper, unbothered by her tone, opened his folder and laid out the supporting documents one by one on the porch railing. The notarized deed, the trust paperwork, the attorney certification, everything filed. Everything legitimate. Everything dated years before that afternoon's argument had ever happened. There was no error to find. Ryan turned to his mother, who was standing a few feet away, quiet in a way Helen was almost never quiet. "Mom, is this real?" Helen didn't answer right away. She told me later that she'd rehearsed this moment in her head more times than she could count over the past 3 years, imagining how she'd explain it, softening the words in her mind so they wouldn't land too hard. But standing there on the porch, watching her son's face, she found she didn't want to soften anything anymore. "It's real," she said simply. Madison's voice climbed sharp and disbelieving. "You gave our house to her to Ashley. Why would you do that?" Helen's answer, according to what she told me afterward, was quiet but unwavering because she's the only one who ever earned it. Ryan wasn't ready to accept any of it. He told Harper this had to be some kind of mistake, that he'd fought for years to protect his family's stability, that no court would uphold a transfer like this without his knowledge. Harper, patient as ever, reminded him that the transfer had never required his knowledge or consent in the first place. It was Helen's property, Helen's decision, and Helen's right to give it to whomever she chose. "There's also a condition attached," Harper added, turning to a marked page. Clause 8. "If either of you is found to have insulted, threatened, or humiliated Mrs. Collins, the residency arrangement terminates immediately." Ryan's face changed again, this time with something closer to dread than confusion. He looked at Madison. Madison looked away. "No one can prove anything happened today," Ryan said, his voice lower now, more careful, like a man, realizing too late that the ground beneath him had shifted hours before he'd even noticed. "It was just an accident, a misunderstanding." Harper opened a second folder thinner than the first and set it beside the deed on the railing. "We'll get to that," he said. "Mrs. Brooks has something she'd like to say first." Ryan tried to push past Harper toward the front door, insisting this whole thing needed to be sorted out inside, away from the street, away from whatever neighbors might be watching from their porches. Harper didn't move. He simply held up a hand calm as ever, and reminded Ryan that until the matter of Clause 8 was resolved, the house wasn't his to invite anyone into. "You can't be serious," Ryan said. "You're going to stand on my mother's porch and tell me I can't walk into my own home." "It's not your home," Harper said, not unkindly, just factually, not legally, not for the past 3 years. Madison had gone quiet in a way that unsettled Helen, more than her earlier outburst had. She stood near the porch railing with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the deed still lying open in her father's hands, like she was waiting for the words on it to rearrange themselves into something less permanent to happen. Harper opened the second folder. Clause 8 requires documentation before it can be enforced. Mrs. Brooks anticipated this might happen eventually given the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed over the years. So, she asked me to compile what evidence existed. "I want to be clear this wasn't gathered today. It's been accumulating for some time." He laid out the contents one piece at a time. A short video clip taken by one of the younger cousins on a phone months earlier at a family dinner showing Madison calling me Dad's replacement. Loud enough for the whole table to hear, and Ryan laughing it off instead of correcting her. 3 written statements from relatives who'd witnessed similar incidents over the years and had quietly told Helen about them, never realizing those conversations would matter someday. 2 text messages Madison had sent to a cousin, screenshots forwarded to Helen, at some point referring to me in language ugly enough that Ryan actually flinched reading it over Harper's shoulder, and Helen's own written statement dated that very afternoon describing exactly what she'd witnessed at the barbecue a few hours earlier. The shoulder bump, Madison's scream, Ryan's ultimatum, my quiet exit. "None of that proves anything," Ryan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. He was scanning the pages now instead of arguing with them. Helen stepped forward. "In 9 years, I don't think I'd ever heard her raise her voice at her son. Not once. Not even when I'd overheard secondhand about disagreements between them. She'd always been the family's quiet peacekeeper, absorbing tension so it wouldn't spread, smoothing things over rather than naming them. Standing on that porch in front of Harper, in front of Madison, she stopped doing that. "I saw everything," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I saw Madison scream at Ashley over an accident. I saw you tell your wife to apologize or leave without asking a single question first. I have watched this happen in smaller ways for years, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your marriage. I was wrong. It was exactly my place. I watched a woman who has done nothing but show up for this family get treated like she didn't belong in it. Ryan stood frozen, the papers hanging loosely in his hand. Mom, I'm not finished, Helen said. You have a daughter who needed boundaries a long time ago. And instead of giving her boundaries, you gave her permission every single time. And I let you, because I didn't want to cause more conflict in a family that already had enough of it. That was my mistake, and I'm not making it again today. Madison's composure finally cracked. She'd been standing rigid through her grandmother's entire statement, but now her shoulders started shaking, and when she spoke, her voice came out small, in a way I imagine none of them had heard from her in years. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was just an accident. I reacted. You've been reacting like that for 9 years. Helen said gentler now, but not backing down. This is just the first time it cost you something. Harper, giving the family a moment before continuing, finally spoke again. Given the documentation, and given Mrs. Brooks's testimony as a direct witness to today's incident, the conditions of Clause 8 have been satisfied. Dee Dee, effective immediately, the residency arrangement is terminated. Mrs. Collins has authorized a 30-day window for you to arrange alternate housing and remove your belongings. Ryan looked at his mother, then at the locksmith still waiting patiently by his van, then at the deed in his own hands, as if some part of him was still hoping the paper might change if he looked at it long enough. It didn't. I need to talk to Ashley, he said quietly. That's your choice to make, Harper replied. But I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you want to say, and why before you make that call. Ryan didn't respond to that. He just stood there on the porch of the house he'd lived in for years, holding proof that it had never really been his in the first place, while his daughter cried quietly beside him, and his mother watched with an expression that held no satisfaction in being right, only years of tired, overdue relief. Ryan called me 11 times that night. I know because I finally looked at my phone around 9:00, sitting alone in the guest room of my sister's house, 2 towns over, where I'd driven straight from Harper's office without going home first. I hadn't decided yet whether I wanted to see Ryan's face when the truth landed on him. But some instinct told me not to be standing in that driveway when it did. I didn't answer any of the calls, not out of spite. I genuinely didn't know what I would say yet, and I'd learned enough in my years of teaching to know that the most important conversations shouldn't happen in anger on either side. Madison texted twice. The first message just said, "Please call my dad." Second, an hour later, was longer, more frantic, something about how this had all gotten out of control, and she never meant for things to go this far. I read both messages and set the phone face down on the nightstand. It wasn't that I didn't feel anything reading them. I did. But feeling something and being ready to respond to it are 2 very different things, and I wasn't ready yet. Ryan told me later, much later, once enough time had passed, that we could actually speak like 2 adults. Instead of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a fracture, that he'd called his mother again that night, hoping she might soften, might tell him this had all been some kind of misunderstanding that could still be walked back. Helen didn't soften. I warned you for years, she told him, according to what he eventually admitted to me. I told you over and over that, if you kept letting Madison treat Ashley like an intruder in her own home, you'd lose something you couldn't get back. You just never believed it would actually happen. He sat with that, he said, longer than he wanted to admit. And somewhere in that silence, things he'd spent years not really looking at started surfacing, whether he wanted them to or not. He thought about the roof. He'd noticed the new shingles on his mother's house 2 winters ago, vaguely registered them, and never once asked who'd paid for the repair or arranged the contractor. It had been me quietly, the way I'd done most things for that family. Not for credit, just because it needed doing, and nobody else was doing it. He thought about the cardiology appointments. Helen had a scare with her heart 3 years back, a series of follow-ups and monitoring visits that stretched across several months. And it had been me driving her every single time, sitting with her in waiting rooms, holding her hand through an echocardiogram, while Ryan sent apologetic texts about being slammed at work. He hadn't attended a single one of those appointments, not one. He thought about the surgery the year before that, a hip replacement that kept Helen off her feet for 6 weeks, and how it had been me who moved into her guest room for the first 2 weeks of recovery, managing her medications, cooking her meals, helping her to the bathroom in the middle of the night, when she was too proud to ask her son for that kind of help. Ryan had visited twice that whole stretch, each time for less than an hour. He thought finally about all the bills, the property taxes he'd assumed his mother handled herself, the insurance renewals, small repairs here and there that seemed to sort themselves out without him ever having to think about them. He'd never once wondered how exactly those things kept getting handled. He'd just been grateful they weren't his problem, without asking whose problem they'd actually become. When he called his mother back near midnight, he told me his voice had cracked in a way it hadn't since he was a kid. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me find out like this in front of everyone?" Helen's answer was quiet, but unflinching. And it was the part of that night Ryan repeated to me more than once in the weeks that followed, like he needed to hear himself say it out loud to actually believe it had happened. "Ashley never asked for this house." She said she never asked for anything in 9 years. Not once. "I gave it to her because she earned my trust in 100 small ways you never noticed. Because you were too busy managing your daughter's feelings to notice your wife's absence of complaints. I didn't do this to punish you, Ryan. I did it because it was the only thing I had that was truly mine to give. And I wanted it to go to the person who actually deserved it." He didn't have an answer for that. He told me later there wasn't one. That for the first time in longer than he could remember, he understood exactly how much he'd allowed himself not to see, and exactly how much it had cost the one person who'd never once demanded to be seen. Ryan and Madison moved out within 3 weeks faster than the 30 days Harper had given them, which I think was its own kind of statement. There was no lawsuit, no drawn-out fight over the deed, no attempt to contest what Helen had done. I think in the end, Ryan understood there was nothing left to contest. The paperwork was clean, the timeline was clear, and somewhere underneath his shock, I believe he also understood it was fair, even if fair was the last thing he wanted it to be. I moved into the house on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in July, with my sister helping me carry boxes up the same porch steps, where all of it had unraveled a month before. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms I'd visited so many times as a guest, and now belonged to me in every legal sense. I spent that first weekend doing something I hadn't done in years, working in the garden Helen had let go untended during her recovery, pulling weeds from beds that used to be beautiful, planting new bulbs along the back fence where I remembered she'd once grown dahlia. I found a box of old family photographs in a hallway closet. Faded pictures of Helen as a young woman, of Ryan, as a boy, of relatives I recognized and some I didn't. I had them reframed and hung them back along the staircase where they belonged, because whatever had happened between Ryan and me, this house held Helen's whole life, and I wasn't going to let that get lost in the wreckage of everything else. 3. A month after I moved in, Helen asked if she could host another barbecue. I said yes before she even finished the question. It felt important somehow to let that tradition continue, rather than let one terrible afternoon define the space for good. It was different this time, smaller, quieter, no shouting across the yard, no ultimatums, no one waiting to see whose side everyone else would take. Helen's sister brought her potato salad. One of the cousins manned the grill without complaint, and I spent most of the afternoon sitting beside Helen on the porch swing, watching the yard fill with people who actually wanted to be there. Ryan reached out eventually, a handwritten letter that arrived in the mail rather than a text or a call, which surprised me. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope before I even opened it. Inside, he wrote about the years he'd spent managing Madison's feelings, instead of protecting our marriage, about the excuses he'd made without ever noticing how many there had been, about the version of himself he was trying to become, now that he'd finally stopped looking away. He didn't ask for the house back. He didn't ask for anything, really. I think by then he understood there wasn't anything left to ask for. I read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light. Then I folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't tear it up because there was no anger left in me by that point, just a quiet, settled kind of peace. But I didn't write back either because some doors closed, not out of bitterness, but simply because you finally found what was on the other side of them, and it turns out to be enough. I think about that barbecue often now, the one where everything fell apart in front of an entire family. For a long time afterward, I believed I'd walked out of that yard and lost something. A husband, a family, 9 years of trying. But sitting on this porch now, surrounded by a garden I planted with my own hands, in a house filled with people who actually see me, I understand it differently. I didn't lose a family that day. I finally stopped mistaking tolerance for belonging, and I walked toward the family that had been quietly choosing me back the entire time. In 100 small ways I'd almost stopped noticing. The morning of that barbecue, I thought leaving that yard was the worst moment of my life. Now I know it was the moment I finally started living one that was actually mine. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where you'd have drawn your own line. Have you ever had a moment where you finally stopped accepting less than you deserved from the people who were supposed to love you? Tell me in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. We share stories like Ashley's every single day here. Real heartfelt journeys about family loyalty and the quiet strength it takes to finally choose yourself. So, if this one stayed with you, subscribe and stay close, because there's always another story waiting and I don't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for walking through this one with me. Let's keep going.